International Men's Day, November 19th, is a global occasion to celebrate the positive contributions and diverse experiences of being male. On International Men's Day 2010, we're talking with Dr. Warren Farrell, author of 7 books including The Myth of Male Power and one of the world's leading experts on gender issues. One of the objectives of International Men's Day is to improve gender relations and promote gender equality. In the 4th video of this series, Dr. Warren Farrell talks about the need for a gender transition movement, as distinct from separate men's and women's movements.
When we understand that, like when we talk to our grandparents about, women's rights or men's rights, the whole concept of rights, they just go, they just like, it's sort of like it's anathema to them. Because from our grandmother's perspective and our grandfather's perspective, the world was not about rights. The world was about responsibilities and obligations. And so when you understand that both sexes, women had the obligation and the expectation to be more feminine by raising children. Men had the obligation and expectation to be more masculine by risking their lives in war or risking their lives in work or raising money, basically. And so so if you have both sets of genders having roles, then what was not appropriate, it was not appropriate to have a women's movement liberating men and condemning, liberating women and condemning men, or a men's movement liberating men and condemning women. It's appropriate to have a gender transition movement where we together make a transition from the old rigid gender roles to more fluid gender roles where a man raising children can be as respected as a woman raising money. The good news is the women's movement has done some wonderful things for women. It has opened and freed women from the old strict gender roles. And that has been, and it's taught women how to be able to not only raise children, but also to raise money. And the good news about that is women have flexibility. But if you think of a family as also including men, brothers, sisters, and husbands, and then you think of the family boat, and we've changed the women's movement has helped women row on both sides of the boat, raise children or raise money. And men have only learned to row on one side of the boat, raise money. In a recession, we need the men to be able to be flexible enough to also raise children while the women perhaps raise money. And so what we've done is we've taught women to row on both sides of the boat, but taught men to row only on one side of the boat. And the problem is that when women exercise their power to row on the side where men can only row on, if men can only row on that side, the boat that is rowed on one side by both sexes is a boat that goes in circles. And a boat that goes in circles is very vulnerable to the rocks of recessions. And so we see a global recession now in which we have women in industrialized societies trained much more effectively to row on both sides of the boat. That's why we need a gender transition movement to help both sexes be able to row on both sides of the boat so all families are much less vulnerable to recessions and depressions.
One step towards a gender transition movement might be the introduction of paid paternity leave, such as has recently been promised by the Australian government. Do you see such progress also taking place in the US?
Not as well in the States as it is in Australia, and also it's taking place very much more so in places like Sweden, and the attitude of Sweden is reflected in its laws, and the laws reflected in its attitude. And for example, the law in Sweden says that if a man doesn't take a full month of paternity leaves, that paternity leave is lost to the family. Now, the woman is allowed to have 2 or 3 months, I think it is, without that. But so when you start having laws that say, if you don't take advantage of something like paternity leaves, that's when you really start saying, we're really encouraging you to be involved. We really recognize and value your being involved. In the United States, we don't recognize and value that enough. And it's worse than that. In the United States, when a man does, for whatever reason, get involved with his children, oftentimes a man gets involved with his children and his income is not as much as the female's. And when an income of a male is not as much as a female's, a woman is much more likely to divorce him. And when a woman initiates a divorce, if she says, I want the children, he often has to spend $50,000 to $150,000, $200,000 to fight for the children, which is absurd because oftentimes, even if he's the caretaker, he still has to fight to be involved with the children, even at a 50% level. And so we have a very negative system going in relation to children having the right to both parents. And it's not even really children having the right to both parents. Both parents, the male and the female, are biologically, the child is biologically half the father and half the mother. So when the child doesn't have equal exposure approximately to the mother and the father, the child is not having equal exposure to both parts of itself. A child that doesn't know half of itself has the parent who's absent become a straw parent. The straw parent, because the child only sees a little bit of that parent. Every parent has problems. Whether that parent's unreliable, irresponsible, drinks too much, or whatever, the mother or the parent at home is likely to say some negative things about that parent. And then as that child grows up and says, well, maybe I'm like that. I'm irresponsible. I lie. Who doesn't? I do things that are irresponsible. Who doesn't? Then the child starts wondering whether I'm inherently irresponsible. I'm inherently a liar. Something's wrong with me. But if you don't know the father, you don't know the parent that that's being said negatively about because you're not seeing very much of them, you start feeling very vulnerable that maybe that's you. And it becomes like the invasion of a body snatcher. It eats up your psyche. And the boy can't or the girl can't talk about it a lot because if you talk about it talk about it to the mother that may be saying some of those things, or the father that may be saying some of those things about to the mother, then you fear that you'll get into an argument with the parent that's saying those things. If you say it to the other parent about whom it's being said, you fear that you'll create an argument between the parents and further destabilize an already destabilizing situation. And so it's a real catch-22 for children in that way. And so we're making a little bit of progress. The very fact that there are some paternity leaves in some countries now is a wonderful thing. But we also find that in the United States and in Canada, and also in Canada until recently, when the laws were modified there to make paternity leaves something that were paid for to a greater degree, there was still a lot of pressure on men not to take those paternity leaves because then this would show that they really weren't committed to their job. They were like women. They were sort of like not going to be responsible. And so many men, especially if the women had taken some maternity leaves, said, I fear that if I do that, this will lead to me not being promoted as quickly, and we need the money, especially if you want the option to stay home. But that's just one little slice of the dice, so to speak, or slice of the cheese or whatever. Another example in that same category is paternity fraud and men's birth control pill is another example. Many times when men do become deadbeats, it's often because they felt that they weren't part of the process of deciding to have the child to begin with. And so not being a partner in the conception, they're also they don't feel very partnering in the process of raising the child, that they didn't feel that they were that they had a true partnership in conceiving. The only way men can take responsibility for that is to have the same type of freedom to have a men's birth control pill, just like if we ever said to a society, gee, we're going to eliminate the women's birth control pill because you have IUDs, you have diaphragms, you have other forms of birth control. Women would say, excuse me, I don't think so. And so men have to fight for that men's birth control pill. Men have to fight to make sure that that when a child is created, that every woman is obligated to report, to get a blood test to make sure that that child is the child of the father that she says it is, so that no father goes through years of raising a child that he's told is his, only to find out that child is not his, and then perhaps abandon that child and then have a child left without a father or without somebody that cares for him or her. Or a man feel like he's been fooled all his life to raise money, which doesn't mean just raising money, but when you're raising money to support a wife and 2 or 3 children, then you are taking jobs that earn more, which usually mean jobs that are less fulfilling.
And possibly more unhealthy and more life-threatening,
Yes,
etc.
exactly. You might choose between a job as a librarian or as a garbage collector, but you'll probably know that a job as a garbage collector will be more available to you than a job as a librarian, even if you have a master's degree in library science. And so because people need more garbage collectors than we need librarians in relation to the demand, because we all need our garbage picked up every week. And so we don't necessarily need a book from a library every week.